When it comes to buying motion sensors, sometimes you really get what you pay for. Whether it's just some cheap crap you got off of Amazon that has really short detection range, or if the housing plastic breaks after you take it out of the box or when you screw it onto the wall, it can be really quite annoying to find a reliable motion sensor. The Everything Presence Lite, however, breaks that mold and really packs in a punch at a lower price point compared to other millimeter wave sensors. This budget-friendly motion sensor has 3 amazing features that really stand out in terms of value, or in my opinion, really make it worth buying and using in Home Assistant. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to set up and use those top 3 features so that you can get the most out of your Everything Presence Lite in Home Assistant. So let's take a look. The first killer feature of the Everything Presence Lite is that it has the ability to create zones based on what it sees out of the sensor. So if you put it up really high in your room, let's say on the top of a bookshelf, or if you decide to wall mount it above the doorway or something like that, you can then partition off what the sensor sees into different areas, and those are called zones. We first need to install an add-on in order to configure the Everything Presence Lite zones. I'll leave a link to that in the description. So by default, it will already have a zone, so the Everything Presence Lite has support for up to 4 zones. For testing purposes, I have the sensor pointed at my dining room and kitchen area. And so to test it, we can click the Enable Persistence button, and then we can go in front of the sensor and walk around, and it'll track our location in the zone. Now, if you try to add a new zone from this page, it's not going to work by default because only the first zone is enabled within Home Assistant. So to fix this, you have to go into the Everything Presence Lite and enable each of the disabled zone entities in order for that to work. So now back here in the zone configurator, we can click on any of the zones we enabled and then draw their zones in the preview window, however we need to. This is one thing I think that Everything Presence Lite can improve is by changing the default configuration on the firmware to have every entity enabled, and then users can disable the ones they want if they don't need other zones. That would make it a lot easier to get started instead of having to wonder why your zones keep disappearing because you didn't check the little hover over text on the zones in the Configurator add-on. So hopefully they can improve that in the future. So I'd recommend having a friend or family member physically stand in the different zones in your room while you are over here configuring where that zone is based on where they're standing. Once you've got it looking the way you want, make sure you save the zones afterwards. And now it's time to create an automation based on something happening in these zones. All right, to show you a quick automation, I've got one here that'll turn the lights on or off when I enter or exit zone 2. I have the trigger as an entity trigger on the zone 2 occupancy. You can change this occupancy to any of the zones if you needed to, but I'm going to do zone 2. I don't have any conditions here. If you're using this for realsies, you'll want to add some conditions. And then down here under the action section, I have a choose statement. Under here, I have this condition. So when something's detected in zone 2, it'll turn on my dining room area lights. And if zone 2 is empty, then it'll turn off my dining room light. Pretty simple. So let's go ahead and see it in action. So when I step into the zone, the automation triggers and turns the lights on. And when I leave the zone, the automation triggers again and turns the lights off. So that was super fast. You can control how long the delay is, and you can change how long it will wait before it triggers that someone has left the zone. In this case, I turned it to 1 second, and that's what made the automation really fast. And so because you have multiple zones, you can add automations for each of those zones for turning on or off the lights. That really gives your smart home a super cool, futuristic feel. So creating zones for your sensor is pretty cool, but this next feature is really awesome. The Everything Presence Lite can also track targets. And in this case, targets just means people. So the Everything Presence Lite automatically detects people and reports it into a sensor within Home Assistant. The sensor will trigger when it detects people moving, and then it'll show their XY coordinates along with how far away they were and then how fast they were moving. And so when I walk within the sensor's field of vision, you can see all of the sensor values change on the right-hand side. And then when I slow down, you can see the speed sensor go to 0 or next to 0 to show that I slowed down from my earlier pace. Another benefit of target tracking is that in the zone configurator, you can see the different targets that are currently being tracked by the sensor. It'll show the XY coordinates along with the speed and resolution, just like the Home Assistant sensors. The one thing to be aware of, though, is that these values won't auto-update by themselves unless you scroll down here and click the Enable Persistence button. kind of like what we did when we were configuring the zones earlier. And so once you click that and then move around, then the values will start changing. This was something I didn't really realize at first, because down here at the bottom, this persistence thing looks like it's related to the zones and not to the zones and to the targets. So maybe they can look at improving that in the future. This refresh button up here to me implies that the value should be refreshing as things change instead of having to press the persistence button down here. So maybe they can look at improving that in the future. The Everything Presence Lite supports up to 3 targets at once. So you can see target 1 is me. I'm standing in one of the zones we created earlier. And then when a family member steps into another one of the zones, you see target 2 changing to become active. And then they stepped out of the zone, and so it became off. The family member didn't want to be in the video, so at least I'm showing you this so that you can see that it supports multiple targets at once. And finally, the third killer feature of the Everything Presence Lite is that this little thing also has a Bluetooth proxy in it as well. A Bluetooth proxy allows the Everything Presence Lite to scan all of the Bluetooth devices in the area around it and can report that information back to Home Assistant. This gives you much better coverage over your smart home. When you add this to Home Assistant, it automatically adds the Bluetooth proxy, so you don't have to do any extra configuration to get that set up. We can see this in action by going to the Bluetooth integration and then going to the advertisement monitor for the Everything Presence Lite. We can then show that the Everything Presence Lite has its own devices that are being scanned. And so these are everything that the Everything Presence Lite can see through its proxy. So let's say we have a MAC address or a partial MAC address of a Bluetooth device. We can actually search for it in here to make sure that it's being seen by the Everything Presence Lite. So let's say our MAC address has D8 in it. We can see that the last 4 are D8F5, and it's seen by the Everything Presence Lite's Bluetooth proxy. And so if we go over here to our settings page, we can see that there's an auto-detected switch bot curtain 3 with the D8F5 MAC address that was scanned via Bluetooth. That's how we know that Everything Presence Lite's Bluetooth proxy is working and is actively scanning for devices and presenting them to Home Assistant for setup. The Everything Presence Lite has an ambient light sensor, but it doesn't have a temperature or humidity sensor, and it also doesn't have an infrared motion sensor. If you're looking for those features, then the Everything Presence 1 might be more what you're looking for. So check out this video where I go over how to set up and install the Everything Presence 1 along with testing it with certain automations, and I will see you over there.